The morning Beatrice Ralston walked into the Colfax County courthouse alone. The sky above Cimarron, New Mexico, was the color of a bruise healing at the edges, purple and gold, and shot through with a thin line of fire where the sun was just beginning to claw its way above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It was the spring of 1878, and the land was waking up mean and beautiful and indifferent to the grief of women who had spent the last 8 months learning how to breathe without the man who had built everything they owned with his own 2 hands. Beatrice was 31 years old, and she had the kind of face that made strangers look twice. Not because it was the prettiest face in Colfax County, though it was handsome by any honest accounting, but because of something that lived behind her gray-green eyes, something steady and quietly burning, like a lamp set in a window against a long storm. Her dark hair was pulled back under a bonnet that had seen better days, and her dress was clean but worn at the elbows, and she carried a leather satchel that her husband Clarence had brought back from Santa Fe 3 years before he died of a fever that no doctor in the territory had been able to name, let alone cure. Inside that satchel was a deed, not just any deed. It was the deed to 412 acres of good grassland situated along the Cimarron River, land that Clarence Ralston had bought and paid for, land that had been registered in his name alone, because in the territory of New Mexico in the year 1876, when the purchase was made, nobody at the county office had thought to ask whether the woman standing beside him might also want her name on the paper. And now Clarence was in the ground behind the little white-painted church on the edge of town, and Beatrice had a son named Thomas who was 9 years old and already knew how to mend fence and read weather clouds, and she had a small herd of cattle and a mortgage that was being patient with her for now but would not be patient forever, and she had this deed, and she needed it transferred to her name before anyone with bad intentions, and a fast lawyer could argue that it legally belonged to someone else. She had heard the rumors, everybody had. There was a land speculator out of Taos named Gerald Fitch, who had been circling properties along the Cimarron like a buzzard with a pocket watch, and more than one widow in the county had woken up to find her land questioned, her title challenged, her life's work suddenly turned into a legal argument that cost more to fight than to surrender. Beatrice Ralston had no intention of surrendering anything. She pushed open the heavy oak door of the county courthouse and walked down the dim hallway toward the clerk's office, her boots making a sharp, determined sound on the plank floor. The smell of the place was the smell of every government building she had ever been in: old paper and ink, and the particular dry dust of authority. A territorial flag hung limp above the door to the clerk's office, and beneath it, behind a long counter of scarred pine, sat the county records clerk, a man named Denton Price. Denton Price was 43 years old and had the particular meanness of a small man given a small amount of power in a place where power was the only currency that mattered. He had thin, colorless hair combed flat against a round skull, and wire-rimmed spectacles that he wore low on his nose so he could look over them at people in a way that communicated, without a single word, that he found them insufficient. He was not technically corrupt. He would not take a bribe, which in Colfax County in 1878 made him almost unique, but he had a talent for obstruction that was nearly artistic in its thoroughness. When Beatrice walked in, he was sorting through a stack of papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who knew that everyone who came to him needed something from him and not the other way around. "Morning," Beatrice said, setting her satchel on the counter. "I need to file a deed transfer." Denton Price looked up over his spectacles. He took her in with the careful economy of a man cataloging livestock. "Name: Beatrice Ralston. My husband was Clarence Ralston. He passed in August of last year. I need to have the deed to the Ralston property transferred into my name so that I can—" "Do you have the original deed?" he said. She reached into the satchel and placed it on the counter. He picked it up and examined it with the exaggerated thoroughness of a man performing competence rather than actually exercising it. He read it through. He set it down. He picked it up again. Then he did something that Beatrice would remember for the rest of her life. He laughed. It was not a polite chuckle or even a condescending murmur. It was a full, open-mouthed laugh, the kind that fills a room, that bounces off the walls and comes back at you from unexpected angles, the kind that carries inside it all the assumptions of a man who has never once considered that his assumptions might be wrong. "Mrs. Ralston," he said when he had collected himself enough to form words, "you cannot file this deed transfer." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her chest. "I beg your pardon. A deed transfer of this nature requires a witness signature, a credible one." He slid the deed back across the counter toward her. "Not a family member, not an employee of the property in question, a disinterested third party of standing. Do you have one?" "I was told I could." "You were told wrong," he said pleasantly, adjusting his spectacles. "Furthermore, there's a question of whether a woman filing alone, without a male relative present to vouch for her legal capacity and standing, is sufficient to complete a transfer of this size. 412 acres is significant property, Mrs. Ralston. The territorial guidelines are—" "The territorial guidelines," Beatrice said, and her voice was very quiet now, which was a sign that anyone who knew her well would have recognized as more dangerous than shouting, "were written by men who thought women were an inconvenience to be managed. Show me the statute that says I cannot file this myself." Price blinked. For just a moment, something flickered behind his spectacles, a slight recalibration of his casual dismissal. But he recovered quickly and straightened, and the condescension settled back over him like a hat settling over a head. "I'm not here to argue law with you, ma'am. I'm here to tell you what this office can and cannot accept. And what we cannot accept is an unwitnessed deed transfer filed by a woman alone. Come back with a witness of standing and we'll revisit the matter." He turned back to his papers in a gesture of absolute finality. Beatrice stood there for a moment, her hands pressed flat on the counter, the deed between them. She was thinking about Clarence, about the way he used to say that the land was their future, Thomas's future, something that would outlast them both. She was thinking about Gerald Fitch and his pocket watch and his lawyers. She was thinking about 8 months of managing grief and cattle, and weather and loneliness all at once, and she was thinking that she had not walked into town this morning, and paid for a room at the boarding house, and arranged for old Mrs. Garrett to look after Thomas just to be laughed at by a small man with spectacles and a stamp. She did not leave. She pulled out the chair that sat along the wall for waiting visitors, and she sat down, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Because Beatrice Ralston, whatever else she was not a woman who gave up. The morning moved slowly around her. 3 other people came in to conduct county business: a rancher filing a grazing application, a Mexican farmer named Aurelio Vega who had some question about a boundary survey, and a young woman paying a property tax, and Beatrice watched Price handle each of them with varying degrees of disinterest, and she waited. The sun climbed. The courthouse got warmer. The smell of coffee came from somewhere deeper in the building, and Beatrice's stomach reminded her that she had eaten nothing since the night before. She was considering whether pride would allow her to go find something to eat and come back when the door to the courthouse opened again, and a man walked in, and the quality of the air in the building changed in a way she could not have explained if asked. Hugh Carson was 34 years old, and he was the kind of man that the territory produced in specific quantities, tall and lean, with wide shoulders that came from work rather than vanity, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something angular and honest. He wore a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark trousers tucked into worn riding boots, and there was dust on him the way there is always dust on a man who has been riding since before sunup. He had a hat that had seen seasons of rain and sun, and dark eyes under the brim of it that moved around a room the way a man's eyes move when he has learned by experience to read things quickly and accurately. He was carrying his own set of papers, Beatrice noticed the county assessor's seal on the top sheet before he folded them under his arm, and he walked up to the counter with the unhurried ease of a man who was comfortable in his own boots. "Morning, Price," he said. "Carson." Price's tone was distinctly less condescending than it had been with Beatrice, which she noted with a tightening of her jaw. "Your grazing renewal." "That's right." Hugh Carson set his papers on the counter and then, before Price could begin his examination of them, glanced over his shoulder toward where Beatrice was sitting. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who is clearly waiting for something they haven't received yet. Then he looked at the deed that was still lying on the counter, partially visible from where he stood. Then he looked at Price, and something in his expression shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. "You helped this lady with whatever she needed?" he asked. "Mrs. Ralston's business is Mrs. Ralston's business," Price said, in the tone of a man who considers a matter closed. "Well," Hugh said, "she's still sitting there, so I reckon her business ain't." He paused and corrected himself in the manner of a man who has at some point been gently educated out of his contractions. "I reckon her business is not yet concluded." Beatrice stood up. She did not know this man. She had lived 8 miles outside of Cimarron for 6 years, and had known most of the county's population in the passing acquaintance manner of market days and church Sundays. But this man's face was not one she could place specifically. He looked like 100 ranchers and cowboys she had seen in her years here. He also, in this particular moment, looked like something more specific than that. "Mr. Price tells me I cannot file a deed transfer without a witness signature," she said, addressing him directly, because she was a woman who believed in being direct. "A disinterested third party of standing," he says. Hugh Carson turned to look at her fully now, and she saw that his eyes were actually a very dark shade of brown, almost black, and that they were looking at her with a quality of attention she had not expected from a stranger. "What kind of deed transfer?" he asked. "My husband's land. He passed last August. I need to put it in my name before someone else decides it's in question." Something moved across Hugh Carson's face then, quick and certain as a shadow crossing a field. He turned back to the counter. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a short pencil. Then he picked up the deed that was sitting there and he read it, not quickly but thoroughly, and the room was very quiet for the length of time it took him to do this. Price cleared his throat. "Mr. Carson, I don't see how this is. I was raised on a ranch," Hugh said, without looking up from the deed. "My mother ran it alone for 11 years after my father passed. Anyone who tried to tell her she needed a man present to conduct legal business for her own land would have met with a response that I won't repeat in a county office." He set the deed back down. He looked at Price. "You need a witness signature from a disinterested party of standing." Price's expression had tightened considerably. "That's correct. I've been ranching in this county for 7 years. I'm current on my taxes, as you're about to verify for me, and I've appeared before Judge Colton on 2 boundary disputes and won both of them, which I believe qualifies me as a party of standing." He picked up the pencil. "And I am absolutely disinterested in this property." He looked at Beatrice then, and she looked back at him, and the moment was so still and so full of something she didn't yet have a name for that she nearly forgot to breathe. "If you'll show me where to sign, Mrs. Ralston," he said. She crossed to the counter. She stood beside him, close enough that she could smell horse and open air and something faintly like cedar, and she turned the deed to the witness line, and he bent over the counter and wrote his name in a clear, steady hand. Hugh D. Carson. The pencil made a dry, certain sound against the paper. Then he straightened and picked up his own grazing renewal papers and set them in front of Price without a word, and the message was so clear that even Denton Price, who was not a perceptive man by nature, understood it perfectly. Price took the deed. He examined it again, though there was nothing new to examine. He stamped it. He entered it in the register. He filled out the transfer certificate in the precise, grudging manner of a man who is obeying rules he wishes he could ignore, and he slid the completed paperwork across the counter to Beatrice, and he said, in a voice stripped entirely of warmth, "Filed and recorded. The transfer is complete." Beatrice took the papers and put them in her satchel, and she fastened the clasp with steady fingers, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Price," in a voice that was entirely professional, and then she turned to the man beside her and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Carson," in a voice that was something else entirely. He inclined his head, just slightly, the way a man does when he is accepting thanks that he means and is slightly embarrassed by. They walked out of the clerk's office and into the hallway together, which was not planned but happened naturally, the way things do when two people have just shared something that matters. Outside on the steps of the courthouse, the sun had climbed to its full morning height, and the town of Cimarron was going about its business in the particular loud and dusty way of a New Mexico territorial town in 1878. Horses at the hitching posts, men moving between the hardware and the dry goods and the saloon, a wagon pulling away from the feed store, a dog barking at something significant only to itself. "I don't mean to be ungracious," Beatrice said, stopping on the top step and turning to face him, "but I want to understand something. You don't know me. You don't know whether that deed is legitimate or whether I'm some confidence artist trying to steal land from a dead man's estate." Hugh Carson looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but something adjacent to it. "The deed had the original county seal from 1876 and was in perfect condition," he said. "The name Ralston matches the Ralston spread that I've been riding past for 6 years. You were sitting in that chair for what looked like at least an hour rather than leaving, which is not the behavior of someone doing something they know is wrong. And Denton Price was laughing when I walked in." He paused. "Price laughs at women who try to do things for themselves. I've seen it before. It's not a complicated thing to read." Beatrice studied him. "You've seen it before." "My mother," he said simply, "like I told Price." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Below them, Cimarron went on being Cimarron. The Sangre de Cristos stood at the edge of the sky, enormous and purple and permanent, and the Cimarron River turned somewhere below the town where it couldn't be seen but could be heard if you were very quiet, which they were. "I have to go back to the boarding house and collect my things and ride home," Beatrice said. "My son is waiting and I've been gone since yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on his head, which he had held in his hands on the steps with a kind of instinctive courtesy. "You ride alone." "I've ridden alone for 8 months," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the flat fact of her life as it was. He nodded. "My spread is north of yours, about 4 miles. I'll be heading back that direction if you want company on the road. No obligation." She looked at him again, this man she did not know, who had signed his name on her deed and asked nothing for it and whose dark eyes were entirely serious. "I'll be ready in an hour," she said. She did not know in that hour what she was agreeing to. She thought she was agreeing to company on the road, to the practical comfort of another rider between here and home, to the safety that any sensible woman alone would welcome on a road that could produce difficulties. She thought she was being sensible and grateful, and nothing more complicated than that. She was, as it would turn out, agreeing to the rest of her life. But she did not know that yet, and so she went to the boarding house and gathered her satchel and her horse and her composure, and she met Hugh Carson at the edge of town where the road turned north, and they began to ride. The road home followed the Cimarron River for most of its length, staying close to the cottonwoods that lined the bank, and the spring air had that quality it only had for a few weeks each year, cool enough to be pleasant, warm enough to be kind, and full of the smell of new green things pushing up through the winter-brown grass. Beatrice's horse, a bay mare named Prospect, moved with her usual steady authority, and Hugh Carson rode a big gray gelding that matched his pace without any visible instruction from its rider. They rode in silence for the first mile, which was not the awkward silence of strangers but the comfortable silence of people who are in agreement about not needing to fill space with noise. Then Hugh said, How long has the spread been running? Clarence bought the land in '76, she said. We'd been in the territory since '73. We started with 30 head and built up to nearly 90 before he got sick. I've kept it around 80, lost a few in the winter. He nodded. He was looking at the land as they rode, with the particular seeing everything expression of a man who has spent his life reading terrain. You're running it yourself. No hands. I have a man named Delgado who comes 3 days a week, and Thomas helps. He's 9, but he's capable. 9-year-olds on a cattle spread are more capable than people give them credit for, Hugh said. He is, she said, and her voice softened around her son the way a voice does when it's talking about something it loves without reservation. Another mile went by. A hawk circled above a ridge to the east, patient and beautiful. Somewhere in the cottonwoods, a pair of doves were conducting an argument. How long have you been in the county? Beatrice asked. 7 years. I came up from Texas in '71. Started with a trail drive, stayed because the land was worth staying for. Bought my place in '73. Family? None here. My mother's in San Antonio. I have a brother somewhere in Colorado Territory, last I heard. There was something in the way he said that last part, a slight flatness, a door politely closed that she didn't push. My family is in Ohio, she said. My parents are still there. They have written 3 times since Clarence died asking me to come back, and 3 times I've written to say that I won't. He glanced at her, and she caught the look from the corner of her eye, and it was the look of a person who understands something without being told the specifics. The land is yours, he said. The land is mine, she agreed. Now officially. They were approaching the point where the road forked, one branch continuing north toward his spread and the other turning east toward hers. They slowed their horses by unspoken agreement. I'm grateful, Beatrice said, and she meant it in a way that was simple and complete without ornament. What you did this morning, you didn't have to. No, he said. I didn't have to. Another silence, this one with something new in it, something that moved between them the way current moves in a river, not visible from the surface but absolutely present. There's a community supper at the church on Saturday, she said. It surprised her even as she said it. She had not planned to say it. Reverend Tate organizes them. Most of the county comes. I know about the suppers, he said. I've been meaning to attend. Then perhaps I'll see you there, she said. She touched her heels to Prospect's sides and the mare moved off down the east branch of the road, and Beatrice did not look back, because she was a woman of 31 who had buried a husband and kept a ranch running in the hardest year of her life, and she had a great deal of dignity. But she listened to the sound of his horse moving away up the north road, and she found that she was paying close attention to exactly how long she could hear it. Thomas was at the fence when she came riding in, which meant he had been watching for her since some time before now, and when he saw her, he dropped the post mallet he'd been using and came running in the cheerful, ungainly way of a 9-year-old boy, and she dismounted and caught him and held him for a moment with her chin on the top of his head, and the land was all around them, green and vast and entirely theirs. Did it work? He asked, muffled against her coat. It worked, she said. He pulled back and looked up at her with eyes that were gray-green like hers and serious like his father's, a combination that sometimes hit her so directly she had to look away. So nobody can take it. Nobody can take it, she said. It's ours. I'll show you the papers tonight. He considered this with the gravity of someone for whom this information was not merely reassuring but foundational. Then he nodded and went to take Prospect's reins, and led the horse toward the barn with the competence of a boy who had been doing this since he could hold a rope. Beatrice stood in the yard and looked at the land stretching away in every direction, brown gold at the edges where the winter grass still held and vivid green near the river where the spring had already arrived, and the house that Clarence had built with help from 2 neighbors and a borrowed set of tools, and the mountains beyond everything. And she felt for the first time since August something that she cautiously identified as solidity, something like the future existing again. She went inside and made supper, and afterward she spread the deed papers on the kitchen table under the lamp and showed Thomas exactly what they said, tracing the words with her finger the way she had traced his reading lessons when he was smaller, and she told him about Denton Price and the laughing, and then she told him about Hugh Carson. He just signed it, Thomas said, with the directness of someone who has not yet been trained to pretend that extraordinary things are ordinary. A stranger. He just signed it, she said. Thomas thought about this. Was he a good man? She looked at her son across the lamplight and thought about the answer to this question with more care than she let on. I believe he was, she said. The days between Tuesday and Saturday were full of work, which was the only mercy Beatrice had ever found entirely reliable. There were fences to check and cattle to rotate to the lower pasture, where the grass was coming in, and the root cellar needed restocking, and the pump handle had developed a loose joint that she wedged and retightened herself with a wrench and a piece of leather. And Delgado came on Wednesday and Thursday, and they worked from sunup to mid-afternoon both days, rerouting a section of fence that a winter-killed cottonwood had knocked flat. Delgado was 52 years old, born in Chihuahua, and had been working the land around Cimarron since before it was part of the territory in any formal sense. He had worked for Clarence, and he had stayed after Clarence died with a simple continuity of loyalty that Beatrice had accepted with the gratitude it deserved and never fully spoken aloud. He was not a man of many words, but the words he used were always exact. On Thursday afternoon, when they were finishing the fence line and the sun was dropping behind the mountains, Delgado said, without looking up from the post he was tamping, "You rode back from town with someone." It was not a question. It was the observation of a man who paid attention. "A rancher named Carson," she said. "He witnessed my deed at the courthouse." Delgado said nothing for a moment, tamping the post with a steady rhythm. Then he said, "I know Carson's land. Good land, well kept. He rides it himself." "He seems capable," she said, keeping her voice deliberately neutral. Delgado glanced at her just briefly with the kind of look that says everything and nothing simultaneously and went back to his post, and neither of them said anything else about it. Saturday came the way Saturdays always did in those years, arriving with the quality of a gift that had to be earned by the days before it. Beatrice dressed with more care than usual, which she told herself was simply because it was a community gathering, and she represented her property and her family and her position in the county. She put on her good blue dress, the one she had worn for the Independence Day celebration the previous summer, and she braided her hair and pinned it up in a way that she was aware was more flattering than her usual arrangement. And Thomas put on his good shirt without being told, which was extraordinary, and they rode to town in the wagon. The church supper was held in the open lot behind Reverend Tate's church, with long tables set up and lanterns strung between the posts that framed the lot, and it smelled like roasted corn and good coffee, and the particular combination of humanity and outdoors that Beatrice found, despite herself, deeply comforting. She had been to enough of these gatherings to know almost every face and name, and people greeted her with the warmth of a community that had watched her navigate the past 8 months and respected what it saw. She did not look for Hugh Carson when she arrived. She had told herself she would not. She helped set out her contribution, a dried apple pie that Thomas had watched her make with the attention of a person documenting a historical event, and she talked with Martha Colquitt about the spring planting, and she listened to Reverend Tate argue amiably with the Donahue brothers about the proper depth for post holes, and she drank her coffee and watched Thomas run off with a group of boys his age. He arrived an hour into the evening. She knew the moment he walked in because she had not been looking for him, and she saw him anyway, which was information she filed away without examining immediately. He had cleaned up, the dust was gone, and he wore a dark shirt and a vest, and his hat was the same but it looked better for some reason she couldn't identify, and he stood at the edge of the gathering for a moment with the particular manner of a man who is comfortable in his own company but not opposed to other people's. He found her in the crowd without any visible searching. Their eyes met across the length of the gathering, and he inclined his head, and she nodded, and that was that. He made his way over eventually, stopping to speak with people he knew along the way, and she noticed that people were easy with him, that men clapped him on the shoulder, and women included him in conversations with the naturalness of someone who is trusted. When he reached her, he had a plate of food and an expression of genuine pleasure at the pie she had brought. "Dried apple," he said. "From our own trees," she said. "Clarence planted them the second year we were here. They're just beginning to produce properly." He tasted a bite, and his expression became entirely sincere. "Mrs. Ralston, this is the best thing I have eaten in 6 months." It was a simple compliment, honestly delivered, and she felt it more than she expected to. She was aware that she had made a great deal of herself not needing anything from anyone in the past 8 months, and that this specific variety of uncomplicated warmth was something she had been carefully not missing, and she felt slightly disarmed by this. "You cook for yourself?" she asked. "I do," he said, with a rueful quality that made her want to smile. "Adequately, not like this." Thomas appeared at her elbow, having returned from his running about with the luminous dishevelment of a 9-year-old, who has been moving fast in all directions. He looked up at Hugh Carson with the direct, evaluating stare that children give to strangers who are standing close to their mothers. "Thomas," Beatrice said, "this is Mr. Carson. He helped me at the courthouse." Thomas extended his hand with the formality that Clarence had drilled into him, and Hugh shook it with the equal seriousness of a man who understood that this transaction mattered. "You're the one who signed the deed," Thomas said. "I am," Hugh said. "Why?" Thomas said. "Because he was 9, and because he was his father's son, and because he had been told his entire short life that there was no such thing as a silly question." Hugh Carson looked down at him with those dark, serious eyes and said, "Because it was the right thing to do." Thomas processed this. "Did you know it was her land for sure?" "No," Hugh said, "but I thought it was, and I'd rather help someone who's telling the truth than stand by while someone who's telling the truth gets turned away." Thomas looked at him for another moment and then nodded, with the decisive finality of someone who has completed a review process and reached a verdict, and went back to his friends. Beatrice and Hugh stood in the lantern light with the sounds of the gathering around them and the Sangre de Cristos visible even in the evening darkness, a darker shape against a dark sky, enormous and permanent. "He's a serious boy," Hugh said. "He's his father's son," she said. And then, because she didn't say it enough and because the evening felt like a place where true things could be said, she added, "He's also the most important person in my world." "That's clear," Hugh said, gently and without pressure, just acknowledgement. They talked for the rest of the evening. Not about anything momentous, about the spring planting and the cattle prices from the last Taos market, and whether the railroad would reach Cimarron or pass it by entirely. He told her about his early years in Texas, a ranch in the hill country, where the summers were so hot the buzzards had to throw their shadows before landing. She told him about Ohio, about how she had met Clarence at a county fair when she was 20 and known within an hour that she would follow him wherever he went, which had turned out to be a very long way from Ohio. She told him more than she meant to. She was not usually a woman who talked readily, but there was something about Hugh Carson in the lantern light that made space for words the way good country makes space for everything that belongs in it. When the gathering began to break up and people were collecting their dishes and calling to their children, he walked her to the wagon and stood while she helped Thomas up onto the seat. "The county assessor's office has a hearing next month," he said, in a tone that was casual but deliberate. "About the land grants along the Cimarron. Price has been flagging certain transfers as questionable. I don't know that yours is on the list, but I'd like to check. I have some standing with Judge Colton, and I know the assessor reasonably well." She looked at him from the wagon seat. "Are you offering to help me again?" "I'm offering to share information that affects both our properties," he said. "My spread borders yours on the north. Anything that destabilizes land titles in this section affects me as much as you." It was a practical framing, and they both knew it was also something else. And neither of them said the something else, because it was Saturday, and they had only actually spoken to each other 3 times, and she had a son and a reputation, and he had come riding out of a spring morning like a man in a story she hadn't been expecting. "I would appreciate that very much," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and stepped back, and she clicked to the horse, and the wagon moved off into the dark, and Thomas sat beside her with his feet dangling off the edge of the bench and his hands folded in his lap like a small dignitary. "I like him," Thomas said after a minute. Beatrice kept her eyes on the road ahead, where the lantern swung at the wagon's front and cast moving shadows. "Good," she said. She did not say anything else, but she was not thinking about anything else, and the road home seemed shorter than it ever had before. April turned into May with the gradual warmth of someone making a kind announcement. The grass along the Cimarron came in full and green, and Beatrice's cattle moved through it with the deep satisfaction of animals doing exactly what they were built for, and the apple trees Clarence had planted put out their first serious blossom since the year before his death, white and fragrant in the morning air. Hugh Carson came by the first time on a Wednesday, ostensibly to talk about the assessor's hearing, which was real and did require some coordination. He tied his gray gelding, whose name she learned was Gideon, at the fence post and sat at the table in her kitchen, and spread out a set of papers that outlined the county's process for reviewing land grant transfers, and they went over them together while the coffee was on the stove. The hearing did matter. There were 3 properties on Price's flagged list, and while Beatrice's was not among them, 2 of them bordered her eastern boundary, and a decision there could create a precedent that affected her. Hugh had spoken with Judge Colton, who had been unambiguous that a properly filed and witnessed transfer was bulletproof as long as the original deed was clean, which Beatrice's was. "Fitch," Beatrice said, when Hugh explained the political dimension that Gerald Fitch was behind the flagging, that he had allied himself with a Santa Fe lawyer who specialized in creating title disputes from thin air. "Fitch," Hugh confirmed. "He's been acquiring disputed properties at reduced rates through a holding company. He'll tie you up in a proceeding long enough to exhaust your resources and then offer to buy you out at half value." "He won't," Beatrice said. He looked at her across the table. "No," he said, "he won't." There was something in the way he said it, a certainty that was not about him being there to stop it, but about him believing entirely in her capacity to stop it herself, and she felt that distinction with something warm and specific. After the papers were put away and the coffee was finished, he stayed another hour and they talked about other things, and then she walked him out to his horse, and Thomas materialized from the barn where he had been doing nothing more urgent than keeping an eye on the proceedings, and Hugh spoke with him for a few minutes about the cattle and the fences and the apple trees, and Thomas was clearly, visibly approving of this man who took him seriously. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Each time there was some legitimate business, the assessment hearing, a water rights question, a conversation about the shared fence line between their properties which was technically Beatrice's responsibility, but which he offered to help mend as a neighborly courtesy, and she accepted because the fence was 3 miles long and she was sensible. They spent 2 days riding the fence line together, she and Hugh and Thomas, who came because he was 9 and it was 2 days on horseback, and there was absolutely no force in nature that could have kept him at home. Those 2 days changed something. Not abruptly, nothing between them was abrupt. It was the gradual change of the kind that happens when 2 people who are good at being alone discover, slowly and with considerable surprise, that they are better in company. Hugh rode ahead with Thomas for an hour each afternoon, talking about horses and cattle and the mountains, and the sound of her son's laughter carrying back on the wind was something she had not heard enough of in the past months, and it undid her slightly, in the good way, in the way that things can undo you when they are putting you back together. By the time they made camp at the far end of the fence line on the first evening, building a small fire in the lee of a rock formation, eating the food Beatrice had packed, with the stars beginning to come out above the mountains in numbers that were always slightly impossible to comprehend, She and Hugh had been talking for 2 solid days, and she had the sense that she had known this man for a very long time. Thomas fell asleep rolled in his blanket like a caterpillar, facing the fire, before the stars had reached their full count, and she and Hugh sat on either side of the fire and talked quietly, and she told him about Clarence, about the real Clarence, not the summary she gave at church and on market days, but the actual man, the one who read poetry to himself on Sunday mornings, and was afraid of horses for the first 2 years they were here, and worked through that fear by sheer stubbornness. The one who cried when Thomas was born, and then tried to pretend he hadn't. Hugh listened in the way he did everything with complete attention, without interrupting, without rushing to fill silences with his own words. "He sounds like a man worth grieving," Hugh said when she had been quiet for a while. "He was," she said. "He was a good man." Hugh looked at the fire. "You don't have to be done grieving," he said carefully. "That's not what this is." She looked at him across the fire, and she understood exactly what he meant, and it was so precisely the right thing that for a moment she could not speak at all. "No," she said, "it's not." They rode home the next afternoon, and when they parted at the fork in the road, he held her gaze for just a moment longer than usual before turning north, and she held it back. June arrived with heat and the particular business that summer brings to a working ranch, and if anything the pace of her days increased. But Hugh came by regularly now, and sometimes she rode up to his spread to look at a water issue or a fence concern, and those visits had a quality that was neither strictly neighborly nor yet anything she had spoken aloud. His ranch was well run. She could see that at a glance, the fences tight, the cattle in good condition, the equipment maintained. His house was spare but not neglected, and it had the look of a place that was waiting, without knowing it, for more furniture. She was there one afternoon in late June when he offered her coffee, and then paused at the stove with his back to her and said, "Beatrice," in a tone that was different from any tone he had used before. She was sitting at the table, which was a plain pine table without even a cloth on it, and the afternoon light was coming through the single west window, and she said, "Yes," and then waited with the whole of her quiet attention. He turned around. He had the coffee pot in one hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that she could read with complete clarity, because it was precisely the expression she had been carrying in her own chest for the better part of 2 months. "I don't want to make this awkward," he said. "If you tell me I have misread things entirely, I'll believe you and we'll go back to discussing fence lines, and that will be the end of it." "You have not misread things," she said. He set the coffee pot down on the stove with a care that was slightly excessive for the task. "I want to court you properly," he said. "I want to do this right. I'm aware that you have Thomas to consider and a position in this county and a reputation that matters to you, and I have no intention of being careless with any of that." She considered him for a moment. "You know," she said, "I have had some very quiet, difficult months, and what I have learned in those months is that life is not so long or so kind that you can afford to be overly careful about the things that matter." He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, and he was close enough now that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was very serious and very warm, the two things together in the way that with him they always were. "May I take you to supper in town?" he said, "properly, not a church gathering." "Yes," she said, "you may." The supper was at the one restaurant in Cimarron that qualified as such, a place run by a woman named Clara Mendez who had come up from Mexico 10 years before and cooked with the authority of someone who considers it her personal obligation to demonstrate what food can be. Beatrice wore the blue dress again and did her hair the flattering way, and when she came out to meet Hugh at the gate, he looked at her with an expression that he made no attempt to moderate, and she felt it with the full weight it deserved. They sat at a corner table and ate Clara Mendez's lamb stew and drank very good coffee, and they talked and talked and talked, the way two people do who have been making careful conversation for 2 months and are finally free to say what they actually mean. He told her about the years in Texas, about working cattle from the time he was old enough to hold a rope, about his father who had died when Hugh was 19 and left a ranch that was beautiful and financially ruined, about the years it took to understand that leaving was not failure but necessity. She told him about Ohio, about the way she had arrived in New Mexico territory at 25 with everything she owned in a wagon and her husband beside her, and the absolute conviction that this was where her life actually began, and how she had been right about that in ways she had not expected. They walked back from the restaurant in the warm June evening, and she was aware of how close he was walking beside her, of the particular gravity between them. And at the gate of the boarding house where she was staying for this visit to town, she stopped and turned to face him, and the last of the daylight was behind him, and she could see his expression with perfect clarity. "You are a remarkable person," he said quietly, with the tone of someone stating a fact. "Hugh," she said, and she said it the way she hadn't said anyone's name in 8 months, with the specific warmth she had kept stored away because there had been no one to give it to, and she saw him receive it. He reached out and took her hand very carefully, the way you reach for something you've been wanting to touch for a long time and are determined not to treat carelessly. His hand was work-roughened and warm, and she felt it all the way to the center of herself. "I would like to keep coming to see you," he said. "I want you to," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, in a gesture that was entirely formal and entirely charged with everything that was not yet formal between them. And then he released her hand and stepped back and said good night in a voice that was steady and slightly rough at the edges. She went inside and sat on the edge of the boarding house bed for a long time with her hands folded in her lap. And she was not sad, and she was not uncertain, and she was not disloyal to anything or anyone. And what she felt was the specific warmth of something beginning. July brought the assessor's hearing, and Beatrice was there in person for it, sitting in the second row of the county courtroom with her deed in her satchel and her spine straight. Hugh sat beside her, which was not something they had discussed, but which happened with the naturalness of things that have been established. Judge Colton was a large, gray-haired man with the careful dignity of someone who has spent 20 years in a territory where the law was frequently improvised, and he ran the hearing with a thoroughness that Fitch's lawyer found deeply inconvenient. The 3 flagged properties were examined. The argument that their transfers were irregular was presented by the Santa Fe lawyer, a thin man named Whitmore who had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to winning in rooms where the other party couldn't afford as good a lawyer. Judge Colton asked questions that were, on the surface, entirely neutral, and in practice were aimed directly at the center of Whitmore's argument, with the precision of a man who had seen this exact play before. At the end of 2 hours, Judge Colton ruled that the transfers were valid, that the filing record was complete, and that any further challenges would require new evidence of actual fraud rather than procedural objection. He also, with a certain deliberate quality, made note that the recent transfer of the Ralston property was similarly airtight and was not under review and would not be. He looked at Denton Price when he said this last part, with a look that Beatrice committed to memory with considerable pleasure. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the July sun that was large and white and not apologetic about it, Hugh said, "That's done," and she said, "Yes," and they both stood there in the warmth of it, and then he said, "Lunch," and she said, "Yes," and they went to Clara Mendez's restaurant and sat at the corner table and ate and talked about the future. They talked about the future the way people do when they have stopped pretending the future is not what they want it to be. He was careful and deliberate, and he was also, she was learning, capable of a quiet humor that came out at unexpected moments and made her laugh in a way she had forgotten she could laugh, full and unguarded. He asked her in September. It was a Sunday afternoon, and they were sitting on the porch of her house, which had become a regular thing over the summer Sunday afternoons when the work was done, and Thomas was somewhere nearby, and the mountains were doing what the mountains did in September, which was becoming more extraordinary by the day as the aspens on the upper slopes went gold. He had been helping her with some repairs to the porch roof that morning, and they had sat down with their coffee, and Thomas had disappeared into the barn with a book, and the afternoon was very quiet except for the river in the distance. He set his coffee cup on the porch rail and he turned to look at her, and his expression was the one she knew now, the one she had been knowing all summer, the serious warmth of it, the complete attention. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to spend my life with you." She looked at him very steadily. And I think it would mean something excellent," he said. "For me. I believe I would be a better man for it. I believe I would be," he paused, searching for the word, "more complete." "You're already a complete person," she said. "Yes," he said. "But there's a difference between complete and." Another pause, and the corner of his mouth moved, genuinely, abundantly alive. She felt the words like warmth from a good fire. "Hugh, I love you," he said, simply, directly, the way he did everything, without ornament or theater. "I think I loved you from the moment you sat down in that chair in Price's office and refused to leave. I know I loved you by the fence line in May. And I love you now, and I will love you for the rest of my life. And the only thing I want to do with that is ask you to marry me." The afternoon was golden around them, the aspens burning on the distant slopes, the river murmuring below, the land they had both worked and loved stretching in every direction. "I love you," she said, and the simplicity of it after months of carrying it was extraordinary. It was like setting down something heavy that she hadn't been aware she was carrying. "I love you, and I have known it for some time, and the answer is yes." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that in the September afternoon, and it was not quiet exactly, because the land was full of the sound of itself, but it was the particular fullness of two people who have arrived somewhere they were always meant to be. Thomas came out of the barn at some point. She was not sure how long they had been sitting there, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the two of them sitting hand in hand in the afternoon light with the evaluating expression that was entirely his own. "Are you getting married?" he asked, with the directness that had made her love him more than she could say since the first moment she held him. "If you're willing," Hugh said, looking at Thomas with absolute seriousness. "This is your home and your mother. I don't step into either of those things without your willingness." Thomas was quiet for a moment. That was, Beatrice realized, genuinely waited, genuinely thought through. "You'd be here all the time," Thomas said. "I'd be here all the time," Hugh said. "You'd help with the cattle. I'd help with everything." Thomas sat down on the bottom step and looked at the mountains for a moment the way his father used to look at things he was deciding about, with a particular quality of stillness. "Okay," he said. "Then, can we combine the herds?" Hugh laughed, and it was the laugh of a man who is entirely, genuinely happy, and Beatrice heard it and pressed it into her memory like a flower pressed between pages. "Yes," Hugh said. "We absolutely can." The wedding was in October, small and real and entirely theirs. Reverend Tate performed it in his church with the aspens still gold in the hills beyond the windows and the air carrying the first real cold of the coming winter. Beatrice wore a new dress that Martha Colquitt had helped her sew from fabric brought up from Santa Fe, a deep green that made her gray-green eyes look like water over stone. Hugh stood beside her in the best clothes she had yet seen on him, and he looked at her with an expression that she wanted to keep in a locked box for the rest of her life. Delgado came and sat in the front row with his hat in his hands, and his face arranged in the expression of a man who is moved, and intends not to show it but is not fully succeeding. Thomas stood up beside Hugh as his witness, which had been his own suggestion, and which Hugh had accepted with quiet seriousness. When the Reverend asked if anyone had cause to object, there was a silence that was entirely comfortable, the silence of a room full of people who are united in wanting this to be. She said "I do" in a voice that was completely clear, completely certain, and when he said "I do" in that voice of his steady and warm and real, she felt it somewhere foundational. He kissed her in the way of a man who has been waiting with great patience and means to do this properly. And there was a sound from the assembled community that was partly applause and partly the sound of people exhaling something they had been holding on behalf of this woman who had been managing alone for too long. They consolidated the two properties over that winter, which was a question of a great deal of practical work, and also of transferring the deed on Hugh's land to include both their names, which they did at the county clerk's office on a cold November morning. Denton Price was behind the counter. He looked at them, at Hugh's hand at the small of Beatrice's back, at the way she set the papers on the counter with the absolute confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and his expression was complicated. He processed the papers without a word of difficulty, stamping and registering them with a thoroughness that had none of the performances of obstruction from before. When he slid the completed documents across the counter, he did not laugh. "Filed and recorded," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Price," Beatrice said, in the same tone she had used 8 months before, professional, exact, utterly composed. Outside in the November cold, Hugh took her hand as they walked to where their horses were tied, and she squeezed it. "That felt," she said, "very satisfying." He laughed. It did. They rode home together on the same road they had ridden in the spring, the cottonwoods stripped bare now and golden-leaved, the river higher with the first mountain runoff. The Sangre de Cristos had their first snow on the upper peaks, white above the tree line, impossibly beautiful against the cold blue sky. "This is ours," she said, as they turned onto the road toward the house, their house now, the combined property that stretched in every direction. "This is ours," he agreed. The winter was the best winter of her adult life. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. Winters in New Mexico territory never were, with the cold and the feed concerns, and the nights that required banking the fire against temperatures that dropped hard and stayed down. But there was a difference in the quality of a hard thing when you were not facing it alone. Hugh was solid in all the ways that mattered, steady in the practical work, present in the evenings, patient with Thomas in the way that was its own kind of gift, not trying to replace something that couldn't be replaced, but building something new alongside it. Thomas took to Hugh with the considered, deliberate loyalty that was characteristic of him. Not overnight, nothing about Thomas was overnight, but steadily, as the winter progressed and Hugh taught him things Clarence had not known to teach him, about horses specifically, and about reading terrain, and about the practical mathematics of running cattle at a profit. And sometimes in the evenings, when Beatrice was reading or mending and the fire was good and the lamp was warm, she would look up and find Hugh and Thomas at the table with the account books or a map, heads bent together, and the image of it filled something in her chest that she had been protecting for a long time. He told her one evening in January that he had written to his mother in San Antonio. "About," she said, looking up from her book. "About you," he said. "About Thomas. About the fact that I have been an absent and negligent son for several years, and I would very much like to have her come and see what I've made here." She set her book down. "You told her about me." "I told her everything," he said, with a warmth that made her aware she was smiling. She wrote back. She said he reached into his shirt pocket and produced a letter that he had been carrying, which she found endearing beyond reason. She said that any woman who filed her own deed and sat in that courthouse chair until she got what was right sounds like the kind of woman she's been hoping I'd have the sense to find. Beatrice took the letter and read it, and his mother's voice came off the page with a warmth that was recognizably related to her son's, direct and honest and full of something genuine. "She sounds wonderful," Beatrice said. "She is," he said. "I've asked her to come in the spring." She looked at him. "You asked her to come to our home." "I asked her to come to our home," he said, with a slight smile. She folded the letter and held it in her hands for a moment. "I would like that very much." She was expecting a child by February, which she had suspected since December and confirmed with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been through this before. She told Hugh on a Sunday morning, standing in the kitchen while the coffee was just beginning to smell right, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that were entirely transparent and entirely beautiful. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and just held her in the way of someone who is containing something too big for words, and she rested her head against his shoulder and they stood there in the Sunday morning kitchen while the coffee finished. "Thomas," he said after a while. "We should tell Thomas. He'll have opinions," she said. "He always has opinions," Hugh said, which was said with pure, uncomplicated affection, and she felt it. Thomas, when told, sat very still for a moment in the manner she recognized, the weighing and deciding. Then he said, "A boy or a girl?" "We won't know until autumn," she said. "I'd like a brother," he said, "but a sister would be acceptable." Hugh laughed and covered it with a cough that fooled no one. "I'll take that under consideration," Beatrice said gravely. The spring came in with the usual astonishing generosity of a spring after a hard winter, green and warm and smelling of the river and the blooming cottonwoods, and Hugh's mother, Margaret Carson, arrived from San Antonio on the stage in late April. Margaret Carson was 61 years old, a woman of medium height with white hair and eyes so similar to her son's that Beatrice felt the familiarity of them immediately. She stepped off the stage in Cimarron with the self-possession of a woman who has been managing things for 40 years and does not expect to stop, and she looked at Beatrice for a moment on the boards of the stage stop and then pulled her into a firm embrace without preamble. "You're even more interesting in person than in his letters," she said, holding Beatrice at arm's length. "He described me," Beatrice said. "At some length," Margaret said with dry warmth. Then she looked at Thomas, who was standing very straight and had his good shirt on, and she said, "You must be Thomas." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. "Hugh tells me you've been running this ranch since you were old enough to hold a rope." Thomas looked immediately at Hugh, who was watching from behind his mother with the expression of a man who is pleased with how things are going. He said that," Margaret confirmed. Thomas drew himself up another half-inch. "That's about right," he said. Margaret Carson stayed for a month, and the month was excellent in the specific way that months are when the person you're getting to know is turning out to be exactly who you hoped they would be. She and Beatrice worked in the kitchen together and talked about everything, about the ranching life and the territory and Hugh as a boy, that particular branch of information that Beatrice found inexhaustibly fascinating, and about the future, about the ranch and the cattle and the coming child. Margaret had a quality that Beatrice recognized because it lived in her son, a complete absence of condescension, a willingness to take a person at face value and let them be who they were without comment. She watched Beatrice run the household and manage the accounts and make decisions about cattle movement with the simple approval of a woman who has always believed in competence as a virtue independent of gender. He was like his father in some ways, she told Beatrice one afternoon when they were sitting on the porch with their coffee, and Hugh was out with Thomas checking the far pasture, and not like him in others. His father was a good man, but he found it difficult to show what he felt. "Hugh isn't like that." "No," Beatrice agreed with warmth. "He's not. He told me when he wrote about you that you reminded him of what land should be. Solid and real and worth everything it takes to stay." Margaret looked at her. "I thought that was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard anyone say about another person." Beatrice looked out at the land stretching away before them, their land, hers and Hugh's and Thomas's, and in a few months someone new's, and she felt the truth of it settle in her with the permanence of something bedded into good deep ground. "He's like that," she said softly. "Everything he says has the quality of being the exact right thing." The summer moved with the full, busy warmth of a good season, and the combined herd was doing well, and the repairs to the buildings were progressing steadily, and Beatrice carried her pregnancy with the practical grace of a woman who has done this before and has too much work to do to be anything other than capable. Hugh was attentive without being fussing, helpful without being hovering, and the quality of being truly, fully known by another person, had settled into her life with the completeness of something that has always belonged there. There were difficulties, because there always are. In July, there was a dispute with a neighbor to the south, a man named Horner, about a water right on a creek that shared the boundary between their properties. Hugh and Beatrice rode out together to speak with Horner, and the conversation was thorough and occasionally heated. And at the end of it, they reached an agreement that was fair and was written down and signed by both parties. And they rode home in the late afternoon and talked about it the way they talked about everything, directly, with all the information on the table, making decisions together. "You were right about the survey line," Hugh said. "I know," she said. "But the way you found the middle ground was better than what I would have done." "What would you have done?" "Argued," she admitted. He laughed. "You argued." "Productively," she said. "The boy was born in October, the same month they had been married a year before. He arrived at dawn on a Tuesday, with the mountains visible through the bedroom window and Hugh's hand in hers through all of it. And when the moment came, and the sound filled the room that fills all rooms when a new person arrives in it, Hugh held his son for the first time with the expression of a man standing at the edge of something limitless. They named him James Clarence Carson, the second name for the man who had built this land and loved this woman and was present in his son's gray-green eyes. Thomas came in the next morning and stood at the side of the bed looking at his brother with the evaluating expression, and then he said with great deliberateness, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Beatrice said. "He does look like a boy," Thomas said, as if this were the primary consideration. "We were hoping for that," Hugh said. Thomas reached out one careful finger and touched the back of James's small fist, which opened slightly in the manner of something new to the world testing what it has available, and Thomas's face did something it rarely did, it softened completely, all the careful evaluation gone, just a 10-year-old boy looking at his brother. "Hello, James," he said, very quietly. Beatrice felt Hugh's arm around her shoulders, warm and present and permanent, and the room was full of the early morning light, and the sounds of the ranch waking up outside. And the mountains were there through the window as they always were, enormous and patient. And she thought that this was exactly the life she had come to this territory to build, not the specific details of it. She could not have invented Hugh Carson or this particular morning, but the substance of it, the solidity of it, the way it was entirely and irreducibly real. She thought about the courthouse, about the chair she had sat in while Denton Price was unhelpful and the law was indifferent, about the sound of a man's boot on the courthouse floor, and the quality of attention in a pair of dark eyes reading her deed with absolute seriousness. She thought about how the whole long thread of this, the deed and the signature and the road and the fence line and the supper in Clara Mendez's restaurant and the porch in September and the October wedding and everything since had come from that one morning, from that one act of simple decency, a man sliding his signature across a counter because it was the right thing to do. She looked up at Hugh, who was looking at James but feeling her look the way he always did, turning his head to meet her eyes. "What?" he said softly. "I was thinking about the courthouse," she said. He smiled, the full smile that she had been collecting all year like something precious. "Is that so?" "If Price had simply done his job," she said, "I would never have needed you." "I know," he said. "I'm very grateful that Price was exactly as obstructionist as he was," she said. Hugh laughed quietly, so as not to wake the baby, and pulled her closer, and she rested against him in the October morning light with her sons in her arms, and the land beyond the window and the mountains beyond the land and the wide, clear sky beyond everything. 2 years went by the way good years do, quickly and full, each season folding into the next with the productive richness of a life that is genuinely working. The herd grew to over 120 head. Thomas, at 12, was running the cattle, accounting on his own initiative and doing it correctly. James pulled himself upright against the furniture in the spring of his first year, and walked at 14 months with the staggering, determined confidence of someone who has decided a thing and intends to do it. Gerald Fitch, it should be noted, overreached himself spectacularly in 1880, attempting to challenge 3 land grants simultaneously in Santa Fe with fraudulent survey documentation, and was exposed in a courthouse proceeding that the Santa Fe paper covered on the front page. He left the territory shortly after, and nobody in Colfax County was inconvenienced by his absence. Denton Price retired from the clerk's position in the spring of 1881 and was replaced by a younger man named Torres who processed deed transfers with the equitable efficiency of someone who had no investment in who was filing them. The first time Beatrice went to the county office after Price left, she stood at the counter and felt the very slight, very private satisfaction of a woman who has outlasted something that was intended to diminish her. Margaret Carson came back twice more, once for James's first birthday and once for Christmas of 1880, when she arrived on the stage with presents for both boys and a particular quality of joy about her that Beatrice had come to understand was specifically about watching her son be fully, genuinely happy. She and Beatrice had developed, over the letters of the intervening months, the friendship of 2 women who recognize in each other a foundational similarity of character, a willingness to call things by their right names and work with what is actually there rather than what should be. In the spring of 1881, Beatrice was expecting again, which she told Hugh in the kitchen in the same manner as before, and his face went through the same sequence of expressions, which she found she would not trade for anything. She told Thomas at supper, who received the information with 12-year-old reserve, and then at the end of supper said quietly, "Another boy would be all right, but James might like a sister." James, who was 18 months old and had no opinion to speak of on the matter, banged his spoon on his bowl. "James has weighed in," Hugh said. Beatrice looked at her family at the dinner table, her eldest son who had Clarence's seriousness and her own gray-green eyes, and who was becoming a young man of real substance, her small son who had Hugh's dark eyes and laughed like someone who has discovered the primary joy of existing, her husband who was looking at her with the specific expression of a man who can't believe his luck and knows it and is grateful every day, and she felt the full weight of it, the whole accumulated goodness of it, sitting in her chest like something heavier than happiness, something more precise and permanent. "We'll see what the autumn brings," she said. The autumn brought a girl. They named her Clara Margaret, Clara for the woman who had made them their first real supper and Margaret for the grandmother who would be told by letter, and would write back at length with a joy that was palpable through the paper. She was born with dark hair and an expression of profound evaluation that she shared with no one in particular, but that made Thomas say, looking at her on the first morning, "She's going to be like Mama." "Is that a compliment?" Beatrice said. "Obviously," Thomas said, with the tone of someone addressing a question that should not have needed to be asked. Hugh was in the doorway with James on his hip, both of them looking at the new baby with varying degrees of comprehension, and he said, "Thomas is right," in the warm, certain tone he used when he was saying something he meant completely. She looked at him across the room, this man who had walked into a courthouse on a spring morning with his grazing papers and his disinterest in small injustices, and had changed the direction of her life with the deliberate act of picking up a pencil, and she thought that she understood now something she had been working toward her whole life, that the love that lasts is not the one that arrives in fire and collapses in ash, but the one that is built, carefully and jointly, and with full knowledge of what you're building. In the same way that a good fence is built, stake by stake, in land you intend to keep. She had fought for this land and she had kept it and she had built it into something beyond what she had inherited. And beside her in the building was a man who believed in her with the same natural thoroughness that he believed in the land itself. And that was everything. That was the whole thing. "Come here," she said to him, and he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed with James still on his hip, and Thomas sat on the other side, and Clara Margaret lay between them making the investigations of someone brand new to the world, and outside the Sangre de Cristos were going red with the autumn afternoon, and the river made its sound below the house, And the herd was in the near pasture making the sounds of a herd at peace, and the apple trees Clarence had planted were full of fruit. And the deed to all of it was in the iron box under the floorboard in the kitchen, the deed that had a witness signature from a man named Hugh Carson. The man who was now sitting beside her with his arm around her and their daughter in the world and their sons beside them and the land all around them and the future extending in every direction like good country under a clear sky, enormous and generous and entirely theirs. "Thank you," she said, quietly, not for anything specific, for everything. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it with the same completeness and the same scope. Outside, the mountains went on being mountains, patient and enormous and beautiful, and the land went on being the land, solid and real, as permanent as anything in this world, carrying in its grass and its good soil the accumulated days of everyone who had loved it and worked it and refused to let it go, and would carry in the same way the days still to come, which were going to be many and good and full.